Violence is a hot topic in the world of psychology today. This month saw the World Health Organization and the University of Cambridge convene 150 of the world's top scientists and criminologists to attend the inaugural Global Violence Reduction Conference. New evidence presented by the United Nations of Drugs and Crime seems to suggest an international decline in interpersonal violence over the last few decades. If such evidence is to be believed, we are therefore in a strange dichotomy. On one hand, we are much less likely to encounter personal violence, whilst on the other, if I were so inclined, I could simply punch a few terms into Google and watch a video of a journalist having his head lopped off his shoulders on repeat. It's therefore important for the scientific community to have a rigorous discourse about the effects of violence in the media on human behaviour. To do this, I went back to a landmark study which addressed the question I should say, in a very nuanced and interesting way. The study was titled Effects of Prolonged Exposure to Gratuitous Media Violence on Provoked and Unprovoked Hostile Behaviour. It was published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology in 1999 and the authors were Zillman and Weaver. The rationale, the reason behind this particular experiment was that in the course of the literature review, the authors seemed to find that many experiments, reviews and meta-analysis of this issue had concluded in the past that media violence did indeed contribute to violence in society. However, there was disagreement amongst the researchers regarding how ecologically valid these findings had been, as most of the experiments had focused exclusively on the immediate effects of media violence on hostile behaviour. They felt more research was needed to examine the non-immediate facilitation of hostile behaviour. The aim of the experiment was to establish whether repeated, prolonged exposure to media violence can facilitate hostile behaviour for extended periods after the exposure. And the authors suggested two separate but concomitant hypotheses. Hypothesis number one, repeated prolonged exposure to media violence did facilitate hostile behaviour for prolonged periods after exposure. And number two, people whose hostility is provoked after the exposure to media violence will act in a hostile manner, whereas those who are not provoked after exposure to media violence will not behave as such. The participants included 53 males and 40 females who were studying an introductory communications course at a southern university in the US. The participants completed a personality assessment which included measures assessing traits such as extroversion, psychoticism, neuroticism, empathy and type A behaviour. The study was described as a video rental study in which participants had to watch and rate 5 films on 5 consecutive days. Participants were then randomly assigned to one of 2 film conditions, either violent or non-violent, and then one of 2 subsequent groups, either provoked or unprovoked. Feature films were shown to all the participants on 4 consecutive evenings, and participants had to rate the potential for the video rental market. On the final day, participants were told that enough data had actually been collected and they were to take part in a substitution project, ostensibly described as a person perception study. An emotion recognition test was administered before asking the participants to rate their impressions of 6 portraits of men and women of different ethnicity and to identify the emotion shown on 6 close-up faces. Portraits were measured on 20 adjective scales and facial close-ups twice, one measuring the emotion expressed and the other measuring the intensity of the emotion. The provoked group was given poor feedback on their ability to correctly identify the emotions, whereas the unprovoked group was given good feedback. A clever little aspect of this was that the expressions were fairly ambiguous, which wouldn't have led to a lot of doubt amongst the subjects as to how they could have scored either so well or so poorly, and subsequently warranted either praise or aberration. Hostility was then measured by an assistant who greeted participants after they had completed the study, and she asked them to evaluate the research assistant's courtesy, competency and support worthiness during the experiment. So in terms of findings, courtesy was rated significantly less favourably than after exposure to violent rather than to innocuous films, and more so in the provoked group rather than in the unprovoked group. Competence followed the same pattern, but the findings weren't as significant. Support worthiness ratings followed the same trends as courtesy findings. Overall, this study demonstrated that repeated prolonged exposure to media violence did facilitate hostile behaviour for prolonged periods after the exposure. Participants, secondly, acted aggressively regardless whether or not they were provoked after being exposed to violent media, although of course those who had been provoked acted more hostilely. The conclusions were that media violence unlocks concepts of hostility which can be triggered by any negative feelings and can support hostile behaviour towards the social environment. In terms of pros and cons of the study, the ostensible nature of the swapping in of the last day of research allows for a pure causality to be inferred from the subsequent results. And of course, with any degree of deception, the ethical considerations must be flagged. Another limitation with the study is that it doesn't measure physical violence, which would be arguably of more societal use to have a fuller understanding of the mechanisms behind that. The feature films were shown in groups of 20, so there's a consideration perhaps of cognitive processing and the group dynamic, groupthink, and similarly a potential skew in the data could arise from the fact that all the research assistants were female. All in all, however, the study's findings were illuminating and statistically robust and significant, and challenged the status quo of the day that anger was an essential prerequisite to violence.